I remember the night Ivy returned as if it were etched on the velvet sky. The frontier town lay silent beneath a canopy of storm clouds, the wind carrying whispers through the pines. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the river gurgled like a restless spirit just beyond my small wooden cabin. In the dim candlelight, I traced the memories of Ivy, a name that fluttered on my lips like a prayer long forgotten. The air was thick with the smell of rain on dry earth and the scent of pine sap, and every creak of the floorboards beneath my boots seemed to echo the years that had passed since Ivy vanished. Out here on the edges of civilization, life clung to the promise of dawn. But that night, every breath of breeze seemed to carry a ghost of the past. Lightning split the sky and painted the world in brief strokes of silver and black. In those illuminated moments, I saw her, Ivy, striding along the muddy road that led into Crimson Hollow. Her dark hair was plastered to her face by the driving rain, and her eyes glinted with a strange mix of fear and wonder. I stayed in the shadows of my porch, heart pounding beneath my thick shirt. I dared not call out. The town children once whispered of Ivy by the river, a sylvan girl who sang lullabies to the moon. Tonight, she was here, and she was real. In that suspended flash of lightning, I noticed a small canvas pack slung over her shoulder, a worn satchel holding the secrets of her journey. The storm was an orchestra around us, thunder for drums, wind for violin, and the river's lullaby for cello. Ivy's boots splashed through the puddles as she walked toward the only lantern left burning at the inn. The warm golden glow spilled through the foggy windows, throwing long shadows against the boardwalk. As she drew closer, the smell of wet wool and smoke from the hearth mingled. The wooden sign of the inn, painted years ago with chipped white lettering, creaked softly above her. Ivy paused at the door, her breathing visible in the thin candlelight. In that instant, 5 years and 500 lost sunsets seemed to fall away. Inside, the common room was quiet except for the hearth's soft crackle and the drip of rain through a leaky beam in the roof. Widow Thompson sat hunched in a corner, rocking in an ancient chair as though hearing a faint melody only she could feel. When Ivy stepped through the door, the candle flames danced wildly as if excited by her presence. Every eye in the room was drawn to her pale, rain-slick face. She stood at the threshold, glistening and trembling as though made of moonlight and storm water. I watched, hidden behind a curtain of shadows, as she clutched the wet brim of her hat to her chest and let out a breathless sigh. There was no grand announcement, no tearful cry. It was just Ivy, alive and standing in the old inn at midnight. I could almost hear the chorus of sighs from the room. She took a cautious step forward, eyes searching each familiar face. The innkeeper's daughter, little Anna, gasped and hid her face behind the counter. John, the blacksmith, stood as if carved in iron when he caught sight of her. Ivy's gaze settled on the fiddle player by the stove, my old friend Marcus, and he swore later that time itself stopped when he saw her. Ivy's shoes dripped onto the wooden floor, sending ripples through the pool of candlelight around her. The candle flames flickered and a singular drop of water fell from her hat onto the rough-hewn table, echoing like a tiny bell. Widow Thompson muttered something about an answer to prayers, but Ivy's eyes searched only one corner of the room, where I stood. I felt her blue gaze fix upon me like a gentle arrow. My breath caught. She was trembling, and for a moment the room was hushed, as if even the storm had paused to listen. In the silence broken only by the rain, Ivy murmured words I could not quite catch, her voice as soft and distant as a dream wisp, and sank onto the bench by the hearth. I remember the way the candlelight lit her hair, giving it the glow of auburn autumn leaves. Ivy looked smaller than I remembered. The wilderness had carved away at her with time. Her cheeks were hollowed by years away from home, and shadows clung to her like a shawl. But when she met my eyes, it was as though no night could ever truly be dark again. For a moment, I felt 14 again, watching her twirl in the meadow behind her family's farm. She was laughing, eyes bright as bluebells, and her hand had almost brushed mine. I had watched her from the doorway, heart pounding, never daring to ask if she might stay. All those years of silent love, and still the sight of her was a bolt of bright lightning through my chest. A scoop of sand and a splash of water. That's what my life had become in her absence. The frontier wind had carried many things, but it hadn't carried her laughter. Now, here she was, alive. In the quiet of that dusty inn, I noticed how Ivy's fingers twitched around the wooden arms of the chair, how the scars on the backs of her knuckles told stories I did not yet know. She wiped her damp hands on her skirt, and I caught the scent of pine smoke and wild mint. We hadn't spoken. I didn't dare break the spell, but the ache in my chest was louder than any thunder. As the storm raged on outside, everyone seemed to hold its breath. Marcus quietly laid aside his fiddle bow. John nodded stiffly, unwilling to speak first. Ivy drew a quilt around her shoulders and looked at the fireplace. Flames danced in her eyes as if to warm old memories. "Hello, Ivy," I finally whispered, unsure why I was the only one who could find a voice. It felt as if the word had been on my tongue since she first left. My voice was soft, hardly louder than the wind's. Ivy turned to me. For a heartbeat, the room shook with something like hope, then settled into a silence deeper than any night. Outside, the storm battered the shutters, and inside we heard every drip of the eaves. Ivy's lips quivered as she smiled, a slow, knowing curve. She said nothing, but in her eyes I read stories of fear and longing. I moved to stand beside her, offering the quiet warmth of my presence. Marcus, the fiddler, after years of quietly mourning his own lost sweetheart, quietly nodded at us, understanding something only he and I did not yet know. We were two souls holding our breath at the edge of something neither dared to speak aloud. The crackle of the fire and the distant roll of thunder were the only answer to the silence between us. And then, finally, a whisper, hers, so soft I almost thought it the wind. "I never knew if I would ever see you again." My throat tightened. The words trembled in the air like a fragile bird's wings. "Nor are you," I answered, trying to sound steady when my heart was galloping like a stallion. She turned fully to me now, candlelight illuminating her face. "I was so afraid," she whispered. Her voice, once so full of youthful determination, was now colored by the pain of all she'd endured. Each syllable was a raindrop in the quiet chamber. Every night I heard the river calling my name. The furrows on her brow deepened, and I realized she was telling me something she hadn't told anyone else. I moved closer, drawn by the vulnerability in her eyes. "How?" I dared to ask. But Ivy didn't answer with words. She reached out with one trembling hand, placing it on the stained wooden table between us. Her fingertips hovered over a knot in the wood, a detail from our childhood treehouse maybe. Then, a flash of lightning from the doorway, like the world deciding to watch. I looked down. Beneath her hand on the table lay a silver locket, my grandmother's, the very one I thought she was still wearing the night she disappeared. The chain was draped there, open, with a small photograph of my younger self peering back. Ivy's hand rested on it, trembling. I swallowed hard at the sight of something that should have remained lost to time. She met my gaze, tears pooling in the corners of her eyes, and said, "I carry your kindness with me, always." The air between us tightened, as if the room itself held its breath. Marcus's fiddle in the corner twitched, as though it yearned to play a tune that could capture such aching beauty. Outside, the wind drew a long, low moan through the trees. I realized then, Ivy had not only returned to Crimson Hollow, she had returned to me. And in that moment, I understood that fate, in its strange compassion, had given us a second chance. The storm began to slumber as midnight approached, but Ivy remained restless. We led her upstairs to the loft above the inn, an old room with slanted ceilings and dusty floorboards that creaked like settling bones. A single candle on the bedside table cast tremulous shadows across the walls, as if the ghosts of those who slept there before stirred at her presence. Ivy sat on the bed, the quilt wrapped around her shoulders, while I held the candle closer to her face to search for answers in her eyes. The flickering light made her eyes seem to flicker with a secret flame. When she finally spoke, it was a whisper, lost in the crackle of the wick. "I've seen the other side, friend." I nearly dropped the candle. Every hair on my arm stood up. "Other side?" I managed. My own voice hushed. Outside, the wind howled in agreement. Ivy nodded, her gaze distant. On a night like this, 5 years ago, I felt myself taken, not by any man's hand, but by the river, by the darkness. I drowned, or so I thought, but I awoke under a blood-red moon far from here. Her voice grew stronger with each word, as if each confession granted her a fierce kind of strength. "They said I died, that I would never walk these woods again." The truth fell through me like ice water. I remembered that night, the rain, the storm, and the terrible shout that no one returned from the flooded creek. But Ivy stood here, alive. Was she a ghost? There was no villain in her story, just the harsh destiny of the frontier. The sound of the river rushing outside felt like an exhale in the room. I wasn't meant to live, and yet here I am. Ivy's face twisted with unshed tears. I set the candle down on the dresser, its flame now steady. I sat on the edge of the bed, close enough to feel the heat of her sorrow. The truth fell through me like ice water. I remembered that night, the rain, the storm, and the terrible shout that no one returned from the flooded creek. But Ivy stood here, alive. Was she a ghost? There was no villain in her story, just the harsh destiny of the frontier. The sound of the river rushing outside felt like an exhale in the room. "I wasn't meant to live," she continued, "and yet here I am." Ivy's face twisted with unshed tears. I set the candle down on the dresser, its flame now steady. I sat on the edge of the bed, close enough to feel the heat of her sorrow. Ivy took a deep breath and told me quietly, "When I came back, the woods spoke to me. The trees and the river, even the stones, they all knew me. They remembered me in the dark." She ran her fingers through damp curls. "At night, I see them. Silhouettes drifting between the trees. I hear laughter behind the walls. I feel a cool hand in the forest, like an old friend reaching out." She paused, as if startled by her own confession. The candle flickered as I watched her remember. My mind raced through folklore my grandmother told me, spirits that wander at twilight, lingering because of love or sorrow. Could Ivy be one of them? As the clock in the hallway chimed midnight, Ivy's voice lowered to a trembling whisper. I see a figure on the river sometimes, a woman with pale hair floating in the mist." She shuddered. "I know she is looking for me, calling me." Every instinct in me begged her to stay, to deny such a thing, but her eyes held the agony of someone who had been listening to the forest for answers and found none. I placed a hand gently on hers. Her skin was as cool as river stones. "Ivy, the river took you, not the devil," I said softly, though truth and comfort warred in me. She smiled sadly, squeezing my hand as lightning threw ghostly patterns on the ceiling. The only answer came from the floorboard under my foot, a groan of old wood, as if the house itself remembered Ivy. In the quiet that followed, something shifted. All the secrets in the night seemed to bow to the intensity between us. Ivy looked at me then, truly seeing me, and I realized with a start that I had never looked away. My voice was almost a prayer when I said, "I'll never let you go." She pressed a trembling thumb into my palm. Outside, the storm had softened to the gentle symphony of rain on roof and tree, but in here, our hearts thundered loudly. I bent to brush a stray lock from her brow. Such an intimate gesture made the world outside fade. Candlelight turned the gold threads of her hair to liquid sunlight. She leaned into that touch with the weight of exhaustion and trust. My own heart threatened to leap from my chest. I wasn't James, her intended, but I loved Ivy with a quiet fierceness I could never fully speak. She was slipping from memory into flesh once more, and I wanted to hold on to every piece of her. We did not need words then. Our hands held the conversation. Her palm fit perfectly in mine, small and warm, trembling with life after so many lost nights. Behind closed eyelids, I saw the wildflowers of spring and the star-crossed stare of two children who grew up too fast. Ivy's breath came steady, the slow inhale and exhale of someone clinging to dawn. In that flickering half-light, I saw an echo of the girl who chased dragonflies along the brook. I saw the woman who returned to me like a dream unwaking. I thought I caught a ghost of a smile on her lips, even though her eyes glistened with tears. Yet for the first time in years, something brighter than sadness lived there, and it was our shared past and the promise of something rescued from fate. Just as I reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, the room's only mirror, an old tarnished-looking glass on the far wall, threw back Ivy's reflection in the candlelight. But behind her, in that reflection, stood another. I blinked, looking twice. Behind Ivy's seated form, I saw the vague outline of a woman, with long pale hair, pale eyes like winter moonlight, her face expressionless and hovering just beyond the wall. The image vanished as the candle flickered again. I gasped softly. Ivy's fingers clamped mine. "What did you see?" she asked, voice low. The mirror showed only the two of us now. I had the sudden urge to pray for this not to be real, but Ivy's breath caught on mine as she watched me. She sensed something too. Perhaps it was fate's twisted design that tonight, when love was finally at reach, we would both see beyond. Dawn was only hours away when Ivy made me promise not to mention her vision to anyone. She blamed it on the candle smoke playing tricks, but I knew what I saw. We stood side by side on the porch as rain slowed to a whisper, staring out over the river. Mist rose off the water in silver veils, and the morning sun began to soften the world. The air smelled of wet pine and fresh earth. Ivy shivered, pulling her shawl tighter, and I wrapped an arm around her shoulders, sheltering her against the cold. "I have to leave," Ivy said finally, the words tearing themselves out of her throat. Her voice was steady, but I could hear her heart breaking behind each syllable. "I promised. When I crossed back from the other side, I promised someone I'd keep moving." I felt a jolt of panic. "But you're home now," I protested gently. "You don't have to go. You're with people who love you." She turned to me, eyes glistening like moonlight on water. "I'm grateful," she whispered. "But the river, it wants me back. It always has." Thunder grumbled faintly as I struggled to find words. "I won't let it," I said, though my voice trembled. Ivy shook her head. "You should," she answered softly. "I have run from fate long enough." The sorrow in her words was a steady weight sinking into my bones. She took a step back, then another, as if drawn by an unseen current. I reached for her, tears filling my eyes. "Ivy, if you go—" My words broke. She put a finger to my lips, "You will never love another like you did me," she said, her own eyes shining. "And I will love you always." In the final light of dawn, I saw her lips quiver as she leaned forward and pressed them gently to my cheek, then brushed my hair away. When her hand fell away, she was already slipping into the morning mist. I could hear the river's gentle chuckle as she disappeared into the day. I stood on the porch, broken and numb, as the sky lightened from gray to pink. They say the stars are the souls of the ones we have lost, but I knew Ivy was different. As the first sunbeams illuminated the silver river, I could see her standing by the water's edge, pale as the moon and twice as radiant. She turned to face me one last time. In that final glance, I felt the warmth of her smile and the eternity of her promise. The wind caught her long hair, and she raised a hand in farewell. Then the mist enveloped her, and she was gone. I have walked many roads since that morning, under sun and storm. But in every breeze that rustles the pines, in every thunderclap that shakes the valley, I feel Ivy beside me. At dusk, I still light a candle in her memory, and sometimes the flame flickers with a whisper of her laughter. If I listen carefully over the river's song, I swear I can hear her gentle voice calling me home. Though our time together was brief, our story did not end. Love, I have learned, flows as ceaselessly as the river, and nothing, not even death, can dam its course. I will tell Ivy's story whenever the night wind rises, so that future souls might find comfort in knowing that some promises last beyond this life. And maybe, under a stormy sky, when candles flicker low, you might just hear Ivy whispering through the pines, calling out to someone like I did, "I am here.